Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Gramercy. Additionally, welcome to everybody who this is their first episode of Gramercy coming over from that FBS series. Trust me, there's some good stuff here too, I promise. In any case, this is a pretty interesting kind of special sort of episode because I've got a couple guests, and they're not people you've probably heard of before. So with me, I've got two friends from real life, which is weird a little bit that I have friends from real life. I've got Miles and Alex, and these guys are absolute experts that have advised me quite a bit on sort of today's build, and will probably continue advising into the future pretty substantially. So here they are.
Hello, I'm Miles. I'll be making a video series under the name Interurban Era on YouTube soon.
And I'm Alex, and I'm just here basically to throw pot shots at everything you do, Jay.
Oh, good. All right, that's why you're here. Anyway, so we're starting here, and this is not the build I'd really planned on doing this episode, so it's kind of a massive distraction. You can see that I'm totally revamping some of the waterfront, like all the way down to the terrain, where I'm sinking it way down. This episode was originally going to be finishing that the World's Fair park, but ended up deciding to do something a little bit different just because I don't really know. It spoke to me, it called out to me, and I just thought, waterfront, it's time. I was really struggling to figure out what a proper build should be, and I ended up starting kind of really getting a lot of inspiration off of a car float, which is this really cool system that is still used today in New York. The one I'm building is going to be long abandoned. But it is a barge, basically, that transports rail cars across the water. So instead of building a bridge or a tunnel, you just float 10, 15, 20 train cars at a time right across the harbor. So what you're seeing me do right here is building out the first sort of generation, the first iteration, I guess, of this build. I'm trying to figure out ways to get the shaping right and sort of float. I see this crane, I really like it. It's a little too narrow, but it ends up being pretty cool later. So real quick, I'm gonna defer to Miles now to tell you a little bit about kind of the history of car floats, because how we met was about this actually, which is weird, but then also model railroading and trains, and particularly through history. So here we go, car float, and why is it abandoned here and now?
Yeah, so car floats have a pretty rich history going back to the mid-19th century. A lot of the early car floats were made entirely out of creaky wood and then later out of steel. They were often used in places with railroads who could not afford a bridge or tunnel connection into a major metropolitan area, New York being a prime example. It was also very commonly used in places like Detroit before they built the tunnel, or the Bay Area for the Santa Fe and the Western Pacific, because they needed to get to places like San Francisco and Richmond where their terminals were, but they needed to serve the ports without having to, build a huge, expensive bridge. They were often barges without anything on top of them, pulled around by at least one tugboat, sometimes two. Later, after the war, an example, the Western Pacific's Las Plumas was a self-propelled one that had kind of a neat flying bridge and very streamlined looking. But after the end of the boxcar era, which is about, the mid to late 60s, early 1970s, car floats started falling off as, trucks and trucking deregulation pushed for just using semi-trucks instead of freight cars for the last mile of freight.
Well, and a lot of the industries that they were serving are basically dying at that point. So you can't really serve anything anymore because there's nothing to take the cars to in many cases. Or you're not serving anything with cars that are small enough that will fit on these barges, Yeah,
you're not going to see any modern, huge triple-level auto racks or anything.
Yeah, that'll be great. Although that'd be funny to do just for a little joke somewhere.
I mean, those cars, they get shipped by sea to begin with, at least. But I think they've kind of lost the rail section of this. Anyway, right here, I'm just building the barge, which is probably not something that would actually just still be floating there in this abandoned old car float. But I thought it'd be neat to try, and particularly because that rusty barge asset that I had just lying around kind of inspired this whole thing. So it's there for now. I might not keep it. Right here is a neat build that's all out of props. It's the It's the lift. I looked up what I called it. Somebody suggested, but it pulls up with cables the section of rail that pivots on one end that can connect the ground to the moving floating barge, which will be at different heights. So it's kind of a weird build and structure. There's a very famous one that I'm basing this off of in Long Island City. It says Long Island on it, and I really wanted to bust out mine and do a custom asset, but man, that just takes so much time.
But this one came out really well for being able to blend some of your Metro Overhaul mod components and the shed. I think it was quite effective in this case.
Yeah. And of course, since, as you said, this kind of fell off in use after like the 60s, probably saw its last train, like very early 70s, late 60s.
Probably.
It's just kind of sat there, just fenced off with that fence right there. Since then, so
nobody's wanted to pay to remove it yet.
Yeah, nobody wants to remove it. Nobody wants to use it. So I got to really kind of make it decrepit. And now's actually when I called Alex and Miles, because I'm like, oh crap, I've built this big freight train line.
I'm gonna get a train to it.
Where do I put this? Because I've kind of surrounded this thing with a residential neighborhood back on the other side of the highway here. So I'm sitting there and I'm just like, I'll just make the terminal first. Maybe it'll come to me. Maybe I'll figure it out. There are a few instances of freight railroads through New York, through Brooklyn. And in particular, I ended up calling and we found the solution, which is just blast it clean through there, pretty much. Now it's a little weird because the railroad was there first.
Right.
But I think you guys were saying it would have been built back in the 20s, 1910s, 20s?
The grade separation project that you're modeling here would be 1920s to remove the train from the street, so you didn't have to trundle at 5 miles an hour with a steam locomotive and a flagman in front of it. But the original line would probably be 1860s or 70s as a street running operation.
Yeah, probably as all this area grew up, it just got too busy and too crowded to be able to pull that off anymore with all the people moving in this area and such. So you would grade separate in order to improve your speed and handling and avoid damage mostly.
And safety.
Yeah. More safety for the goods than for people. That's what they cared about at the railroad, but nevertheless.
So the famous grade separation project in New York, of course, is the High Line in Manhattan, which went up. But I felt that, I want to do a High Line later, so I feel like doing multiple would kind of dull that effect, for one. And two, I think in an area that's just this built up, it would be easier to just blast a block out and do this lower separation where you bridge all the streets. Additionally, because the line here comes from the dockyard, it's actually almost perfectly level from the waterfront where it's basically at sea level underneath kind of as the rest of the landmass that this neighborhood sits up on. It just stays level and just goes straight underneath all these bridges with, I tested, enough clearance for cars. Not that any cars would run down this, at least freight cars. So right here, I'm building something on your recommendation, Biles.
Yeah, so you've got a little, for all of these operations, there's at least one dedicated switching locomotive for these operations. So you'd have an engine house at the end of this terminal, so you could maintain this one or a small fleet of locomotives to switch 24 hours a day the car float operation and nearby industries.
And actually, nearby industries, very good segue. So right here, I'm blasting this rail right through all this luxury development, which is a little backwards, because in reality, luxury development would have blasted through this rail back. Well, the rail would have been well abandoned by then. But it's a really nice thing, and I've wanted to incorporate this into Gramercy for a long time. Is kind of these scars of old rights of way and old rail lines that just kind of meandered through these neighborhoods, serving industrial buildings and factories and warehouses, just like a few boxcars at a time, that now you can't really manufacture at that scale anymore. It's just way too small. So there's just no use for any of these lines. So a lot of it has now transitioned to these areas that were formerly industrial, and now they end up in their nice waterfront districts. So Roebling here, which is my Williamsburg, Brooklyn sort of alternative, though it's also taking a lot of inspiration from some of the Queens waterfront up in just north of Greenpoint, is this former industrial, and it's still kind of an industrial area, which I was a little surprised by in just kind of some of my research and looking up these areas, because I've lived nearby them for a while, but never really explored them too deeply, other than to go to hipster breweries and music. But like I definitely thoroughly enjoyed the gentrification involved around here. But I end up going through and looking very carefully and seeing a lot of this old rail infrastructure that served all these places, which when you think about it makes a lot of sense, because there are these perfect areas where you could get ships right into the harbor. They could dock at hundreds of docks all along the water and just transfer their stuff right onto train cars, which would go to the rest of the city, to wherever, and vice versa. You could get these factories that would put stuff onto train cars that would then go to main lines, or even just use the rail network to move around the city to get to the boat that they're supposed to go on.
And sometimes it's also so they can access two different railroad companies and have them compete against each other for the value or the price of the shipment.
So right here, actually, I'm messing around, and I thought like a really huge block. I was looking at the Brooklyn Army Terminal for some of this, which has this great section down the middle. It's basically two long parallel warehouses with a bunch of really awesome, like, I might say Art Deco, but I feel like
no, you're correct.
Alex, you might get a little mad at me. I don't quite. It turns out that now when I compare myself with PhD.
Yes.
I'm not quite as as good at that as I thought.
You're right century. That's good.
Well, right century is maybe not quite all I'm going for, but I end up just not quite having the right assets for that, and it didn't quite fit the area either, because that army terminal there is still used. Even the railroad down there is still used, and I kind of wanted to save that prototype for a little later. I don't really know where I'll fit it, because I'm fast running out of waterfront, especially waterfront that I want to have be built up industrially. So it might just have to fall to the wayside here.
We'll find a place.
Or you can find a place. But I go through, I end up picking a different sort of prototype. And I actually think I cut the blocks up a little bit. So that was on your recommendation, Alexander. Why?
Oh, this is the linear lot scenario?
Yes.
Yeah. So a lot of those waterfront lots are actually perpendicular to the water. They're long and linear. And a lot of that's because you had, there were cutaway slips for ships between several of those buildings. So you had to have it sort of parallel in order to load those ships. But also you've got scenarios too where some of these lots persisted in that shape because they might be brownfields, or they might be a scenario where maybe someone was holding out on one of the lots and not all of them could have been assembled by any one particular developer. So it's quite common that you'll see the footprint of these old buildings still exists in the lot lines, even if they've been gone for generations.
Yeah, the brownfield sites is one of the ones I really liked kind of building, because I think we just kind of put it together. Now, you got a lot of these beautiful modern parks that are more than likely just caps for brownfield sites. So these old factories have just made the ground beneath them so toxic that you're not allowed to have people live on top of that anymore, which means that I guess a lot of developers or the city just says, like, you know what, let's improve it with parks. So a lot of these lots that I was building, right here I'm going through, just real quick, sorry, just a total distraction while I build something else. I decided to turn part of that sunken freight line into an active subway line, because I wanted to see subways driving around. And that required, of course, with Metro overhaul, it meant I needed to figure out a new way to connect it with the Metro depot. So I had to refactor some of the subway yard over here that we built, I think way back in like episode 4, back when this was a weekly series. But I end up going and struggling trying to make a realistic sort of approach. It ends up a little messy, but better than it is now.
Well, we should point out that this is also based on a prototype. Where was this located, the sunken grade-separated rail line / subway line?
It's located somewhere that I've had pulled up on Google Maps in my other monitor for a long time. It's kind of central Brooklyn. There's this freight line that actually comes from an active car float in, I think, Bay Ridge, that you can trace all the way. And throughout its run, it has like 3 or 4 different subway lines coming up and paralleling it for a little while, then splitting off. There's a movement to activate it entirely for a new subway line, the Triborough RX, which is a pretty interesting plan to completely I think they still want to run freight at night or something, which would just complicate legality things. It would just make it really hard to do that. But it's an interesting idea because all of this track is already here, and it's clearly already serving a lot of subway stations and subway lines. So you end up with this like existing train track through the city that meets up with a whole bunch of subway stations for transfers, goes to a lot of places that don't have a lot of other subway transfers as well, and isn't used for subway, which is weird. But I'm building kind of the first step of that here. And of course, struggling with trying to build stuff below fully built and detailed things as it tries to snap subway lines to pedestrian paths, because, that's how this game works sometimes. So I go through, and this is actually, hilariously and a little weirdly, it's taken this long. This is Gramercy's first, majority subway line. It's definitely not at its full length. It's going to be stretched into the downtown area soon, but the other one's majority elevated, so I've got 2 lines now. And of course, we jump right back into what we were talking about, some of these waterfront areas, and back to brownfields. So right here, this block actually gets split, and half of it becomes one of these likely brownfield cap parks, which are really nice and modern. So this is a fun one to get to build.
Yeah, they're probably, in reality, there would be a concrete dam out by the water that would prevent any any water leaching through whatever's underneath there getting into the water system. And then on top of it, there would be a thick concrete deck. And then on top of that, you build these, beautiful modern looking parks. Got to hide all that environmental remediation that's going on.
Yeah, so I'm curious to see what will happen to those someday, because in theory, it will kind of clean itself up after enough time.
Some do and some don't. There's some that are meant to clean by water infiltration going through intentionally and leaching through in the same way that it would in a sewage treatment plant. Mm-hmm. But there are others where it's permanently capped, and the idea is it's just completely isolated
just
for all time.
Forever. Yikes. Yeah, there's some, and especially around New York, just because it was so industrialized before, there are a lot of...
Asbestos Factory there or something,
Yeah.
So.
They're just sitting there pumping out asbestos for 50 years, and they're like, oh crap, maybe not.
I think we're making a mod for that, aren't we? The asbestos mod.
And now you can rent an apartment a block away from that asbestos factory for $4,500 a month, and it's a studio or something like that. But hey, it's beautiful right on the water. Just,
At what cost?
You can drink at the craft cocktail bar that's called Asbestos.
Yeah, exactly. Very hip. Trust us.
Don't mind the silver flakes in your drink.
You're a realtor. Anyway, I'm going through here and just detailing the car float a little bit. This is a little of kind of an all-over-the-place episode because I kept getting myself distracted. In fact, I nearly called it, the distracted episode, but that's probably not a great thing to lead with for a video that a lot of people are going to be the first one they watch. I'm experimenting now with different textures for this park. So I figured it would be interesting to try and do something that's a little less prop heavy than just plastering the whole thing with decals. So I've decided to put them on a diagonal and alternate these tile decals with just the plain concrete. And I end up really liking it. So I go and I pair them a little bit under these planters, and it feels suitably modern. I mean, one annoying thing that's hard to do in cities is we can't really get a lot of curved ground treatments. And so many of these parks have these beautiful concentric circles of different tile work and fountains and water features. And I look at them and just oh, it would be perfect to be inspired by that curved end of the park and just radiate that shape through. It's my inner landscape architect. But not really possible. We're kind of a very square game when it comes to development stuff. So we end up with just this nice long park, and it feels suitably modern. Those planters, the tiered planters, are just fantastic for it. And of course, it's next to this beautiful, nice park, and across the street, this warehouse that's presumably cleaned up and loftified. And I'm thinking about lofts or something again over here, and I'm trying to get scaffolding and cranes. What if this is one under construction, or realistically, under restoration. Yeah. I go and I'm looking around the Google Maps through all of this, and I find a place in Brooklyn. It's just this warehouse with these 2 rusty old cranes on the end. I'm like, perfect, that's so cool. Mm-hmm. It's almost a little weird that the cranes would still be there and not be taken down because they look rusty as hell and liable to collapse. But I ended up saying, like, you know what, screw it. Let's put an active industrial sort of building here. Like some sort of thing, maybe rezoned to like light industrial. So it's now industrial studios of some sort. So it's like a bunch of people's Etsy shops, maybe.
Glass making.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
Artisanal glass making, whatever.
It still requires industrial processes, but not like huge production scale.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's your mass market graffiti art stuff.
Yay, abandoned track.
Yeah. Yeah, so this track is actually based off of, we went down, we took a little trip down to San Jose last weekend to buy model trains, because that's what we do on the weekends. But I saw this out the window of the train. It's this old industrial spur line that they'd never pulled up the track on, but clearly weren't ever planning to use again. So they just built their air conditioner units and things out on the tracks, which I thought was this really weird sort of look, but I liked it enough to replicate it here in Gramercy. Moving on, I've got this little lot, and what's really nice is I could use that new decorative wall network to just cover up that world hole that I'm tearing with this parking lot road.
Oh, that's neat. I've never seen that before.
Yeah.
Who makes that?
I think Lost Gecko makes that. But I figured just like, you know what, a little abandoned lot here. It's a really tricky place to work with. I thought like a park or a parking lot or something, but it's on such a steep slope because it's kind of where the city transitions to the waterfront height from city height.
Right.
Which is, to be fair, it's an awkward transition slightly in Brooklyn as well. For areas like Dumbo, where you just end up with a bunch of weird slopes and weird grades. But here it's really compressed just because I kind of hide it, or not really even hide it, accidentally did it based on where the highway is. So
there's a lot of that all around the country, though, these weird odd lots that are barely buildable.
So I end up just dragging a parking lot road, and this is kind of where, and if you guys are at all familiar with, like, if you know what I do on, like, when I crash other people's streams and stuff, I haven't been that big on parking lot roads just because I feel like it enables a ton of people to just keep making the same parking lot over and over and over. But I end up kind of falling in love with the actual networks themselves in this as a way to not make parking lots.
Yeah.
It's just a really nice, I downloaded the worn ones, which I think is the best road texture we have right now.
Yeah.
Especially with the kind of awkward, sad, partial death of some of the Roads United stuff. But it lets me, like, keep some roads nice. Like, not every 2-lane road in Gramercy is this cracked up, deteriorating, like, awful place. Some of them are going to be pretty nice, but some of them obviously are not. So I got to include all of these different worn roads. It's also really nice and wide, which I feel like would be important for this area's kind of industrial heritage, or industrial legacy, as we named the episode, where you'd have to have room for trucks to drive around trains that were parked in the middle of the road, just because that's the way it works.
Right.
Sometimes there's even unloading in the street, and back in those days.
Jesus, it would have been cool to see trains like driving in the street. Would not have been cool to like be hit by a train in the street. So I'm not quite sure if I missed that
happened a fair amount too.
Yeah.
So
I mean, in New York as well, it was the avenue before they built the High Line. I think it was 10th Avenue or 11th Avenue. It was called Death Avenue.
There you
that was
go.
the nickname.
And now you know why we've got that grade separation going on.
Exactly. I've actually been, and hilariously, and this is true, there's now a fantastic hipster cocktail bar called Death Avenue right around there.
Awesome.
It's fun. They've got a really nice
So maybe
back
like
garden.
the son of Gramercy's mayor at the time was run over by a train.
Was hit by a
and so
train,
it's
yeah.
like, we've got a grade separation.
Everybody's got it, yeah. I mean, that's what's crazy is that's the way a lot of this worked too. A lot of political activism of like nothing changed unless it happened to an important person, and then all of a sudden there are just these massive top-down reforms, which is like, and yep, that's our incident. Everybody's got it.
Yeah, I mean, just like every rule on the railroad is written in blood, I'm sure that a lot of city planning follows the same route.
Yeah.
Certainly what traffic engineering does.
Oh, yeah.
Real quick, this is a very modern building for this section of the city. And that's a little intentional, a little just because the building fit the lot quite nicely. But I believe you guys said I kind of honestly just liked it and thought like that fits, that looks about right. And of course you guys came over and just like, oh, let's figure out when that would have been built. Like, let's find the dates. Mm-hmm. I think you said like 60s as well, like early sort of
definitely early
prefab construction.
Yeah, early to mid 60s concrete tilt-up warehouse, like with the expectation that it would handle boxcar traffic, but the railroads had declined so severely to trucking at that point that they never saw any railroad service.
Yeah, so you can see that kind of long stripe along the side of I think you said those are like boxcar doors originally. Though now it's where trucks back up across that loading dock area. And I think that makes a lot of sense considering its current, like its alignment. I sneak a vanilla incinerator in there just because I thought I liked the smokestacks out the top. And also it doesn't hurt because all these people complain about garbage all the time. So I go through here, and now is when I find these parking lot roads. I'm like, you know what, let's do it. And I widen every road in this area to the parking lot road.
Nice.
Which becomes interesting because there's no, like, it gets rid of a lot of the crosswalks, which I feel like looks good because some of those vanilla crosswalks are just a little bit, like, heavy visually to me.
Definitely.
And then as I go through here, I'm looking around, and I start kind of really thinking about what other things to maybe include here, and there we go. I end up putting this very large tower in, and I've got to jump in to prop it up to remove these stuff. And this is a fun one because the lot line is restricted by that railroad track. And we were thinking, like, the Colossal Systems Railroad just didn't want to sell that. They knew what they had. They maybe even still own that little 8-foot ride.
They saw the developer coming and thought, oh, he's loaded with money. We're going to ask like $50 million for this piece of track. And
they just decided, nope, and just built the building straight up against the edge of that. And I feel like that probably happens on. I don't have like a specific prototype for this, but the building just fit the dimensions well enough. And I felt like originally I'd planned this area to only have like 2 or 3 towers, but on later checkings of Google Maps, it ended up, I'm just like, nope, this area is built up like crazy now with all these new towers and everything. So let's do that. I also realized that a luxury building like this would need parking. So I actually grabbed this after a little bit of experimentation with tunnels. I grabbed this self-storage place, which just perfectly matches the color scheme and ends up like that's our parking entrance now. So I stick it in and just like, yep, there it is. I wanted to see if I had like a big park sign or something. But just a little bit of planters later, copy and paste my bike share platform there, my bike share station, because that's something that brand new fancy development really just needs. And then give it a little stripe of brick just to be unique and to break up some of the concrete. And I think that's about it for this building. I think it gets some planter stuff, but...
remember, the bike share always has to be on the worst street.
Yeah. I mean, God forbid you remove parking. So right here, I had this giant, super square, big block that was all completely redeveloped, and I was trying to figure out, like, how do I break that up interiorly? I don't know. And I thought about, like, different placements and things. This is actually kind of the section of project that ends this episode, and it ends unfinished just because I want to say I got bored, but I'm like, you know what? Maybe I've built so many like industrial areas and luxury developments for the past few days. I'm a little spent and would be better coming back later with a fresh eye, and I could find somewhere more interesting or find somewhere I passed up. So this gets the standard like long, thin block treatment, as we were talking about. I put a ferry dock in because I'm like, wait a minute, like bad options for like transit options for a gentrifying waterfront neighborhood, 100% some enormously city subsidized ferry. I'm going in now and quickly adding a bike lane network because, as we're talking about, this is a gentrified area, which means they are the people that complain about bike lanes because they're all very rich hipsters. So I thought about making this small little isolated network that came from the ferry dock, but realized that's a little unrealistic, so I actually went and improved and added bike lanes to roads all the way to the rest of the bike lane network. So it's getting robust here in Gramercy. It's gonna be bikeable in some way. This block, I think I just fill it with a bunch of legacy industrial buildings, just warehousey sort of stuff.
There's always a few holdouts.
Yeah, or there's always a few buildings that were industrial and are now bars and are now like conversions, but not
art galleries.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
Like
not
that.
full redevelopment. I go through here and I'm not 100% sold on this technique yet, but I'm trying to shape the edge of the warehouse. So many of these warehouses, and they look really cool ones, have these beautiful curved edges to maximize space along the railroad. But
hint, hint for asset creators.
Yeah, that would be nice. I'll get into building making someday and make those unless I get beat to it.
It's like a 4x4
please
quarter round.
Yeah,
be so
those would be
useful.
awesome to see. But I end up kind of Tetrising it sort of okay. I'll change it someday. We get the rail right-of-way pulled back a little bit there and replaced with something so fancy as dumpsters, and still kind of learning what those dimensions mean. And I was like, that'll work. Oh, no, wait a minute. They can't back out like that. So I know, just totally going for the little 3-car lot there. Trying to cover that buffer point or the end of the rail line. And there we go. With that little surface painter screw up, that's definitely all fixed now. That's the end of the episode. So as you enjoy these nice cinematics as we pan over some of the new built areas, and you can see just how nice it would be to live here next to asbestos factories and other chemical plants and things, I'm going to pass it off to these guys. Just very huge thank you for them being on right now. Let me know if you would like them to be on. Don't let me know if you don't, because I feel like that might hurt their feelings a little bit. So just keep it to yourself. But real quick, they're going to share where you can talk to them and find them, because I think we're going to have some City Skylines builds out of them soon. If not, they're definitely having more stuff with me coming soon, including some big cool stuff that you'll want to see. So, Miles?
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, Jay. You will eventually find me as Interurban Era on YouTube.
And I'm at Akita Builds on Twitter.
Nice. Thank you guys so much for being on. Thank you, viewers, all for watching. Maybe you'll be on someday. I don't know. Anyway, be sure to subscribe to stay updated to this, be updated to FBS airport stuff, and any more stuff that I'll have coming out in the future. So thank you guys again very much for watching, and I will see you next time.